In accordance with Standing Order 43, the time for members' statements has concluded. The Prime Minister.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I seek the House's indulgence to speak about the tragic events of 20 January in the Burke Street Mall in Melbourne. On behalf of our Parliament and the Australian people, I send our heartfelt condolences to the families and friends who lost loved ones, our prayers for a speedy recovery to those who are injured, and our thoughts, our sympathy to all of those who witnessed this horrifying criminal act. It was an ordinary day shattered by terrible violence. 6 innocent people lost their lives. Another 37 sustained serious injuries. To the Victorian police, paramedics, firefighters, ambulance workers who responded so quickly, selflessly and professionally, but who will carry their own scars of that day too, we are humbled by your service, and we offer you all our deepest gratitude. When I visited the memorial of flowers in the days following the attack, I met with the men and women of the Victoria Police, who work night and day to keep the people of Victoria safe, as do our police and security services, the finest in the world, all around the nation. That Friday afternoon they took on threats and horrors many of us would find almost unimaginable. They and all of our emergency services deserve our solidarity at all times. They will always have our absolute, unequivocal, total support. To the doctors and the nurses, ambulance workers, who gave each trauma victim first-class care and treated their families with kindness and compassion, we say thank you. But, Mr Speaker, I know that all of the first responders would expect us also to thank and honour the bystanders in Burke Street that afternoon for their extraordinary acts of humanity. The young man who tried to stop the car before it drove into the crowd. Staff from local businesses who used their own first aid kits or defibrillators to begin immediate treatment of the injured. Shopkeepers who offered the public refuge from the fast-moving vehicle. Those who shaded the injured from the sun. Those who were injured but felt their injuries were not as bad as others and encouraged the ambulance workers to look to the more severely affected first. The cabbie, the office workers, the shop assistants, the law student who set aside their own fear to offer assistance, a reassuring word, or the immeasurable comfort of a human touch. Actions that illustrated the strength of the human spirit and which the paramedics, the police and the fireys praised for making their work so much more able to be completed. Mr Speaker, our sorrow is tempered by the way Victorians and the Australian people more broadly responded to this senseless act, and that was with love. The community has rallied, contributing to the Burke Street Fund, offering support through acts of great generosity or words of sympathy, leaving floral and written tributes. That show of solidarity says so much about the people of Melbourne, about the people of Victoria, about all Australians. And I will take this moment to say again, as I did in the wake of that shocking crime, to the Premier and to the Lord Mayor and all Victorians, that all Australians stand with you as one community, with you as your community heals from this dreadful day. Now, Mr Speaker, there are important lessons to learn from this. The Victorian government is examining and reviewing the state's bail laws and processes, as they should. Last year, following the truck attack in Nice, terrorist attack, I tasked the counter-terrorism coordinator to review the challenge of protecting places of mass gathering. While the review found that we had largely robust protections in place, it was also clear that more work was required. And I've therefore commissioned a national strategy for protecting places of mass gathering, and agencies are working closely on this with the states. This is a very real issue. We saw in Nice what a truck was able to do, and we saw in Melbourne what a motor car, a completely widely available vehicle, a simple motor car, was able to do. So this protection of places of mass gathering is a very important issue. We cannot ever eliminate all threats, we know that, but it is our first duty as governments at all levels to keep Australians safe. But today, Mr Speaker, our thoughts and prayers, first and foremost, are reserved for the 6 families who are learning to live with the loss of their loved ones. There are no words that will ease their pain, but we hope that they will feel the love and support, the absolute resolute solidarity of the Australian people, and draw from this the strength that they will need as they travel this most difficult of journeys, reconciling themselves with this shocking loss.
The Leader of the Opposition.
I thank the Prime Minister for his words just then. Friday the 20th of January was in so many respects a typical Melbourne day. It began with an unexpected rain shower, quickly giving way to sunshine. The Australian Open was on. My hometown was packed with tourists, shoppers, workers. And then that day was shattered. I've lived in Melbourne nearly all of my 49 years. The Burke Street Mall is a place that every Melburnian, every Victorian and probably every Australian knows. We've caught the 86 and the 96 tram along the mall. Many of us can picture the mall with our eyes closed. I've visited the Myer Christmas windows as a child, and I've taken my own children to see them. I think perhaps that's why this tragedy has affected us so strongly. Because unlike some of the tragedies and disasters which confront the human condition, this one wasn't somewhere else. It was one which could have affected any of us, as we've all been there. On the Sunday, like the Prime Minister, the Premier, the Mayor, like thousands of Victorians, I visited the GPO and laid some flowers out the front. It was later in the afternoon. I was in a supermarket in Essendon in my electorate when a strong, burly bloke came up to me and he summed up the feelings written on so many faces and written on so many cards. He simply said about Burke Street, "What is the world coming to?" Mr Speaker, what is the world coming to when this can happen? This was not an act of political or religious terrorism. It was a crime of senseless violence. The victims were chosen by cruel circumstance. They just happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. Matthew C., a son, a husband to Melinda and a father. Jess Moody, a daughter and twin sister to Emily. Bhavita Patel, a daughter and a sister. A 25-year-old visitor from Japan whose family have asked for privacy in their grief. And 2 children, Talia Harkin, aged 10, a week away from starting grade 5, and Zachary Bryant, who was just 3 months old. It has been said before in the English language, a wife who loses her husband is a widow. A husband who loses his wife is a widower. Children who lose their parents are orphans. But there is no word for a parent who loses a child. The unfillable hole of pain, that whole body shock of why my family, it's too much for a single word. Those of us who do not know cannot imagine. Those who do can never explain. Yet in their tributes, the families have not spoken of how they died, but how they lived. The brilliant student, the much-admired colleague, the caring father, the badass sister, the beautiful baby. And these families, with all their losses and pain, have thanked their fellow Australians for their kindness and compassion. Such grace in grief is truly remarkable. Mr Speaker, like the Prime Minister, many people who were on the scene that day have spoken movingly of the kindness amidst the chaos. At the vigil at Federation Square that I attended, a young man named Henry Dow told the story of Lou, a taxi driver, who in shirt and tie took calm command of all around him. In a world where we've seen too much iPhone footage of violence on the street, too many helicopter angles of attacks on the innocent, it would have been entirely understandable of Melburnians to flee the scene in that moment of fear. But the footage only shows our people, our fellow Australians, running towards the danger, administering CPR, comforting the wounded, even as there were still shots ringing out. They did what I think we hoped we all would when confronted by the same set of circumstances. But perhaps we wonder in our hearts if we would be as brave as these fellow Australians. They saw strangers in trouble and did not see them and did not think of them as strangers. Ordinary people who were extraordinary. This goes for the police too, the emergency services personnel, the trauma hospital teams desperately trying to keep people alive. Mr Speaker, the most important job of every government is the safety of our people. I know that bail laws are different in every state, but what Australians in every state cannot understand is that when offenders have done horrific things, when the red light should be flashing, they are out, they are on bail. Burke Street has gone deep into the consciousness of Australians. It stirs the same emotions as the murder of Teresa Bradford in Queensland. And all the others, in particular women, killed by violent partners at large in the community. At every level of government, we need to get better at identifying the warning signs and using every measure to keep people safe. Today, the Parliament salutes the courage of our citizens. We honour the care that our people show for one another, even in the hardest times, especially in the hardest of times. We embrace those in mourning and those in pain, and we pay our respects to those stolen from us. May they rest in eternal peace.
I thank the Prime Minister and the Leader of the Opposition. As a mark of respect to the memory of the deceased, I invite all present to rise in their places. I thank the House. I inform the House of the deaths of Russell Neville Joseph Gorman, a member of this House, and Russell Brunel Trude, a former senator. Russ Gorman died on the 3rd of January this year. He represented the division of Chifley from 1983 and the division of Greenway from 1984 until 1996. Russell Trude died on the 9th of January. He represented the state of Queensland from 2005 until 2011. As a mark of respect to the memory of both men, I invite all present to rise in their places. I thank the House. The Prime Minister on indulgence.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I rise to acknowledge the passing of Anne Deveson, AO, on the 12th of December, at the age of 86. And I extend our condolences to her son Joshua and her granddaughter Odessa, who are with us today. Josh, please accept our sympathies, particularly in the light of your sister, Georgia Blaine, another award-winning author, just a few days before that of your mother. Anne Deveson, Mr Speaker, in her own words, led a varied and extraordinary life. Her career took her from broadcast journalism to filmmaker to social advocate in an accomplished and passionate lifetime of work. Her profound appreciation of the humanity of others was evident in her questions to 2GB listeners and in her books on ageing and resilience. In essence, she said, we share the same longing for peace and love, the same need for respect, the same fear of pain and suffering, the same desire for joy. Anne will best be remembered for the way she helped change the approach to mental health care in Australia. She was fundamental in starting the support network that became Sane Australia and in advocating for the carers and the families of those with schizophrenia and other mental illnesses. Her calling to advocacy stemmed from her eldest son, Jonathan, being diagnosed with schizophrenia as a teenager. Her book, Tell Me I'm Here, is one of the most thought-provoking and compelling accounts of the life of a person with schizophrenia, as well as the decisions, the fears, the bravery, the medical advocacy that defines the lives of the families and friends who love and support them. Anne was made a member of the Order of Australia for her services to the media and an officer of the Order of Australia for her work in community health. I know that Anne felt the love and respect of the Australian people who looked up to her as representing the very best in our society: humble, stoic, hard-working and generous. We still, Mr Speaker, have a lot more to do as we address mental illness, something about which there has been a taboo for many years in terms of our acknowledgement and awareness. We have a long way to go. We have a long way to go until we restore what Professor Ian Hickey has so profoundly called the mental wealth of nations, the profound interest that each of us have in the mental health of every other Australian. Anne Deveson is in no small measure the reason for why we are on this journey. She pointed the way, she walked with us with encouragement and compassion. The progress we've made, she can be accorded considerable credit. Our commitment to continue, our determination to succeed, the leadership she chose to give us and the direction we are taking is her legacy. We, Josh and your family, accept our condolences. Anne Deveson, a great Australian who dedicated so much of her life to helping her fellow Australians.
The Leader of the Opposition.
A few years ago, Anne Deveson was driving down a familiar street and suddenly realised that she couldn't remember where she was going. She found herself popping around to the neighbours to check the date, and then coming back an hour later because she'd forgotten the answer. The tests confirmed what she knew. Like her mother, her grandmother and her great-aunt, Anne had Alzheimer's. In December last year, only 2 days after the passing of her daughter, Georgia, Anne's long goodbye came to an end. Today, the Parliament recognises her extraordinary contribution to Australia. Her work on the Royal Commission on Human Relationships, which drove the decriminalisation of homosexuality, the legalisation of abortion, and the establishment of the first refuges, safe accommodation for women fleeing violent homes. And when it came to breaking down stigma, Anne was just getting started. For her time, she was an unusual radio journalist. She did so much work with people on the ground and invited those people into her studio. She was driven by an insatiable curiosity about how Australia worked. In 1991, Anne published her most famous work, Tell Me I'm Here, the story of her son Jonathan and his schizophrenia. An unvarnished, unflinching book full of heartbreaks and hard truths. There is fear in Anne's story, fear for her safety and her son's violent episodes of psychosis, and fear of losing her son, the warm, intelligent, funny eldest of her 3 children, losing him to an illness that shatters his self, or losing him to addiction and overdose. There is anger. Anger against the unfairness of it all. Anger at a system sceptical of schizophrenia's very existence, preferring tough love or a firm hand. And above all, there's extraordinary honesty and authenticity. As one reviewer put it, a determination to scratch old wounds and feel the pain anew. This clarity of purpose was behind everything that Anne did. Her daughter, Georgia Blaine, herself a brilliant writer, inherited this honesty. It's in every line of Births, Deaths and Marriages, which addresses her postnatal depression, another subject so often considered taboo. Mr. Speaker, the great writers of fiction use their creative powers to take us to an imaginary world. Historians and biographers take us back in time with their gift of their storytelling. But I think that Anne Deveson and Georgia Blaine, they put themselves on the page. They submit the reader to their frailties and their failures, their pain, their loneliness, the scars on their soul. I think this is not just their gift as writers, it was their gift as people. Honesty, integrity, the courage to be who they were without apology. Anne Deveson fought discrimination, she fought stigma, and she fought for the people she loved. Her qualities, her inspiration, the power of her example will live long in the story of this nation.
I thank the Prime Minister and the Leader of the Opposition, and again, as a mark of respect, I ask all present to rise in their places. I thank the House. As members will know, today is the 50th anniversary of the horrific 1967 Tasmanian bushfires, which killed 64 people, injured 900 more and destroyed countless thousands of livestock, buildings, vehicles and property. I grant indulgence to the member for Denison.
Thank you, Speaker. Speaker, the Black Tuesday Tasmanian bushfires are, to this very day, the state's deadliest fires and one of Australia's worst. In total, 110 fires burned throughout large parts of southern Tasmania, including the Derwent Valley, Glenorchy, Hobart, Kingborough and the Huon Valley. The fires stretched from Hamilton and Bothwell down to Snug and the Channel. Tragically, 64 people died and some 900 were injured. About 1,500 homes and other buildings and a similar number of vehicles were destroyed. Stock losses amounted to approximately 62,000. Near where I live, terrific little fern tree was virtually wiped off the map, with about 2/3 of the houses destroyed, along with the hotel, the shop and the parish hall. But, Speaker, as is often the case, out of these dreadful events came stories of great heroics and extraordinary generosity, of neighbours helping neighbours and strangers helping strangers. Speaker, today, on the 50th anniversary of Black Tuesday, we remember all those who lost their lives, as well as the thousands of families affected. We have deep respect for what they endured and thank the survivors for how they rebuilt their lives and laid the foundation of today's Tasmania. Thank you, Speaker.
I thank the member for Denison. The Prime Minister.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Mr Speaker, as the honourable member has just described, 50 years ago today, southeastern Tasmania was engulfed in an inferno that is to this day the state's most catastrophic natural disaster. 64 people lost their lives, another 900 were injured, 1,400 houses and buildings were destroyed, thousands left homeless, tens of thousands of livestock perished, livelihoods were destroyed. The disaster received worldwide attention. President Johnson of the United States expressing his profound sympathy for the people of Tasmania and all Australians who have suffered as a result of this misfortune. Time and again, in the face of natural disaster, Australians show grace under pressure, bravery in the face of danger, and rally selflessly, without a second thought, to help each other. Our thoughts today are with the people of Tasmania, those who remember, those who suffered loss, and those who rebuilt their lives. We remember all those who helped in those difficult and dangerous times, and through acts big and small, helped their neighbours recover, repairing communities, restoring infrastructure. We thank the firefighters, the other emergency personnel and the volunteers who courageously put their own lives at risk and coordinated all of the arrangements, all of the logistics to ensure that the fire could be defeated and the aftermath recovered. Most of all, we remember and honour with admiration the resilience and the courage of the people of Tasmania.
The Leader of the Opposition.
I thank the member for Deveson for reminding the House of this anniversary. February the 7th, a Tuesday in 1967, a Saturday in 2009, is seared in the memories of Tasmanians and Victorians alike. Black Tuesday remains the worst bushfire in Tasmanian history. 62 Tasmanians lost their lives, over 900 were injured. Thousands more lost homes, pets, crops, livestock, and those other countless treasures that fires claim: the photo albums, the films, the scrapbooks, the handmade memories and heirlooms gone for good. In their place, the imprint of fear. The memories of lost loved ones, narrow escapes, the heart-stopping recall of a last-minute decision to flee that nearly wasn't made. Now, 50 years is more than enough time to replant crops, to regrow trees, to rebuild homes and communities. But for many Tasmanians, time will have not faded the memories, dimmed the sadness or eased the pain. We stand with them today.
The Leader of the House.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I ask leave of the House to move a motion to enable statements on indulgence on the Burke Street tragedy, the deaths of former member Russ Gorman, former Senator Trude and Anne Deveson, and the 50th anniversary of the Black Tuesday bushfires in Tasmania to be made in the Federation Chamber.
Is leave granted?
Leave granted.
Thank the Manager of Opposition Business, the Leader of the House.
I thank the Manager of Opposition Business, and I move that statements on indulgence on the Burke Street tragedy, the deaths of former member Russ Gorman, former Senator Trude and Anne Deveson, and the 50th anniversary of the Black Tuesday bushfires in Tasmania be permitted in the Federation Chamber.
Question is that the motion moved by the Leader of the House be agreed to. All those of that opinion say aye. To the contrary, no. I think the ayes have it. The Prime Minister.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I table a revised ministry list and I seek leave to have the list incorporated in Hansard. And I take this opportunity to congratulate those who have been appointed to new positions on the 24th of January. Mr Hunt, Senator Sinodinos, Dr Gillespie and Mr Sukar. In particular, note that the member for Hasluck, Ken Wyatt, appointed to the ministry, is the first Indigenous Australian appointed to the ministry in a Commonwealth government.
I thank the Prime Minister. Questions without notice. The Leader of the Opposition.
Thanks, Mr Speaker. My questions to the Prime Minister. Australians have been shocked and sickened by the crimes that have been revealed through the Royal Commission into Child Sexual Abuse, including yesterday's tragic and indefensible revelations. Will the Prime Minister join with me in reassuring the people of Australia that we will do everything in our power together to make sure that this never happens again and that survivors get the justice and redress they deserve?
The Prime Minister.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I can assure the honourable member that we are all committed to ensuring that redress is provided to the survivors of child sexual abuse by the responsible institutions. As the honourable member will be aware, we have announced a Commonwealth redress scheme for survivors of child sexual abuse in Commonwealth institutional settings. The scheme will be established by next year, 2018. It will comprise a monetary payment, psychological counselling and a direct personal response to acknowledge the wrongdoing inflicted upon survivors. We are inviting the states, territories and other non-government institutions to join in the Commonwealth scheme to deliver redress, and this announcement, Mr Speaker, has been widely welcomed by survivor groups, institutions and states. We encourage all institutions, as I said, to participate in this. We call on the opposition to support the Commonwealth scheme. In 2009, honourable members will remember the apology to forgotten Australians had bipartisan support, and we would encourage the Labor Party on this occasion to throw their support behind our scheme. This is a national shame, as the honourable member described. Redress is available. We've set up a scheme that will do that, but the most critical thing that all of us must remember is that this type of abuse, this abuse, in any context, can never happen again. This is not just a history lesson. This is not just a sad tale from times past. This is a reminder to all of us today, in every part of the nation, to protect the vulnerable in our care, the children in our care, in whatever context.
The member for Fairfax.
Speaker, my question is to the Prime Minister. Will the Prime Minister advise the House on how the government is backing hard-working Australians? And what is the government doing to help Australian households get ahead?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the honourable member for his question. Mr Speaker, everything we do as a government is focused on getting help and support for hard-working Australian families. We are standing up for them. We have put in place the policies that will deliver more jobs and better jobs, more investment, more employment, wider opportunities for their businesses, and, of course, providing the security that is the foundation on which that opportunity depends. Mr Speaker, there is no more important item on the household budget or on the budget of a business than the cost of energy. Indeed, for some businesses, it is the single most important element, as it was when I was there with the member for Wannon at Portland Aluminium, a business for whose survival its workers, members of the Leader of the Opposition's old union, the AWU, what does that business need? It needs big export markets to sell its aluminium, and it needs affordable electricity. And the Labor Party today, the Labor Party of 2017, is opposed to free trade, trying to dive down into the black hole of protectionism, and at the same time has a set of policies that will absolutely guarantee more expensive electricity and less reliable electricity. Let's look at the facts. When the Labor Party was last in power, electricity prices increased by more than 100% and by as much as 120% in some parts of the country. And, Mr Speaker, the reality is this. The Labor Party's ideologically driven approach to energy results in more expensive and less reliable electricity. And you don't need to be an economic modeller to know that's true. Look at South Australia. There is a state suffering from long-term state Labor government with an energy structure that is giving that state the most expensive and the least reliable electricity. And whether you are at Olympic Dam or whether you're a tuna fisherman at Port Lincoln or whether you're a family in Adelaide, right across that state, they are paying the price of Labor's incompetence when it comes to energy. We stand for more jobs, better jobs, more investment, encouragement to business to invest, bigger markets to send our goods and services, and above all, we stand for lower energy prices. Only the Coalition has the vision and the objectivity to deliver that.
The Prime Minister's time has expired. The Leader of the Opposition.
Thanks, Mr Speaker. My question to the Prime Minister. It is a matter of record that 34,000 full-time jobs have been lost in the last year, that underemployment is close to record high, and wages are growing at the slowest rate on record. Prime Minister, when 34,000 full-time jobs have been lost in the last year alone, why are you only worried about your own job and not theirs?
The Minister for Energy and the Environment will cease interjecting. The Prime Minister has the call.
Well, thank you, Mr Speaker. I thank the honourable member for his question, because it gives me the opportunity to remind him in the last year there are 100,000 new jobs in manufacturing. There's been a long time since we've seen growth in manufacturing, and the reason we're seeing it is because of the big export markets we've opened up and that he would like to close in his new populist protectionist guise. You know, this is the this is the leader of the party that used to be the party of Hawke and Keating, that believed in cutting business taxes because they knew that that would create greater investment and more jobs. They knew that trade was good. Trade means jobs. That's what Julia Gillard said. Trade means jobs. Not anymore. Not anymore. He wants to put the walls up as the Leader of the Opposition. And of course, depriving Australian businesses of their export markets. What he now wants to do is to make energy unaffordable and unreliable. Mr Speaker, not only is energy in that Labor sort of test bed of energy management, South Australia, the most expensive in Australia, but businesses in South Australia, and I was with them only a few days ago in South Australia, in Port Lincoln, are having to spend millions of dollars in backup generators because they cannot rely on the electricity system of their state. And why is that? It is because of Labor's utterly unplanned ideological approach to energy. Now, the fact is, we are creating the jobs and the opportunities in Australia. Everything we're doing, every single policy we have encourages investment, whether it is our business tax cuts, improve the return on investment, you get more investment, you get more investment, you get more jobs. The largest investment in defence capability in peacetime in our nation's history, cutting-edge, advanced manufacturing, benefiting Australian businesses right through the supply chain, across the nation. What did the Labor Party do in that 6 years in office? Mr Speaker, they did not commission one single naval ship from one Australian yard. The reality is the only achievement of the Leader of the Opposition when it comes to jobs is when he was a trade union leader. He was a champion at trading away his members' penalty rates in return for contributions from employers to the union. And as a minister, Mr Speaker, he was the absolute Olympic champion of 457 visas, never to be outdone.
The member for Wide Bay.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Will the Prime Minister advise the House what the government is doing to support the household and small business budget? How will the government's energy policies deliver lower power prices?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Yeah, thank you. I thank the honourable member for his question. Mr Speaker, this is the reality that we face thanks to a failure of policy by state Labor governments over many years. We have a situation where, without any regard to the consequences for the stability of the grid or the affordability of electricity, Labor governments and would-be governments, in the case of the honourable member's opposition, have pursued utterly unrealistic, unaffordable, renewable targets without giving any thought as to what their consequences will be for the grid, for households, for affordability. Now, we are here in Australia blessed with some of the largest gas reserves in our region. We will shortly be the largest exporter of LNG in the world. And yet we have, in Victoria, a state Labor government has closed down one large power station, increased 20% of the state's electricity, had the result of increasing electricity costs in Victoria, and then, when we all know that in every assumption gas is the transition fuel, you need gas to come in and take over from coal and gas will be the transition, they've locked up all the gas. No, not the Victorian government. The Victorian government will not even allow the exploration of onshore conventional gas in Victoria. So there you have massive gas resources in Victoria, and you have people crying out for the energy. Businesses, Victorian businesses, who need gas for their feedstock, have been examining the possible importation of LNG into Victoria. Can you believe that, Mr Speaker? There they are, this ideological left approach that the Labor Party adopts, sitting on all of this gas.
Members on my left.
And they're not prepared to touch it. Mr Speaker, we have a roadmap that we've set out, and it is very simply this. We will deliver.
The member for McMahon will resume his seat. The Prime Minister has concluded his answer. I'm going to the next. The Prime Minister hasn't. Okay. The member for McMahon. Member for McMahon on a point of order, and I take him back to last year. I know it's the first day.
Thank you.
On frivolous points of order.
Mr. Speaker.
So I'll get just before I call him, I'll give him a second to think. The member for McMahon
Thank
on
you,
a
Mr.
point of
Speaker.
order.
Has the Prime Minister heard of Gladys Berejiklian?
The member for McMahon will leave under 94A. The Prime Minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Mr Speaker, we have a national renewable energy target, which will be a challenge to meet as it stands, but we will meet it. But we have at the same time state Labor governments with extraordinary renewable targets, 50% in Queensland by 2030. Do you know how much renewables are now? 4%. How are they going to get there? They want to get to 50 by 2030. It is a recipe for unaffordable, unreliable electricity. Labor stands in the way of jobs.
The member for Port Adelaide.
Oh, thank you, Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Energy Markets Commission modelling shows that emissions intensity scheme would save consumers $15 billion on their power bills. But within hours of Senator Bernardi objecting to the government even considering such a scheme, the Prime Minister caved in and ruled it out in December. Given that Senator Bernardi has now quit the Liberal Party, will the Prime Minister reconsider an emissions intensity scheme, or are there still too many government MPs who hold the same views as Senator Bernardi to prevent the Prime Minister from taking the right action?
The Deputy Prime Minister and the Leader of the House will cease interjecting. The Prime Minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. We're not going to take energy policy lessons from the Labor Party, Mr Speaker, because the proof of their pudding is on
Members
every
on my left.
electricity bill. They have delivered. They have delivered higher and higher prices for electricity. And what we will do is ensure that we have a clear-eyed, objective approach to energy policy, because the objective has to be simply this: to get affordable electricity, reliable electricity, and to meet our emissions reduction targets. The reality is very simply this, that the Labor Party has pursued renewable energy as an end in itself, without having regard for the need for baseload power, without having regard to the fact that all of their assumptions about gas prices have been overtaken by both a massive rise in the cost of gas and its constrained availability, and without making any plans for the storage that is needed to make renewables viable. The Labor Party has absolutely failed Australians in energy policy. We are approaching this professionally, objectively and determined to ensure that we keep electricity and energy prices as low as possible, energy is reliable, and that we meet the international commitments that we entered into in the Paris Treaty.
The member for Bowman.
Yeah, thanks, Speaker. A question to the Treasurer. Will the Treasurer update the House how the government is securing Australian jobs and lifting wages for hard-working Australians? And in a globally competitive environment, Treasurer, what are other major economies doing to attract opportunities for small business and for families?
The Treasurer has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for his question about what the government is doing to support investment and to drive the earnings that Australians so desperately want to earn more in this country. As they move forward in a climate of great global uncertainty, what the Turnbull government is doing is providing that certainty with policies that support investment in this country, that drive the jobs and drive the growth that is necessary to support ordinary Australian households. Now, Mr Speaker, that includes the support in the budget we announced for start-up investments in innovative new companies. It includes the infrastructure investments and the $50 billion of infrastructure that we continue to roll out, which includes everything from dams and things in the north with roads and infrastructure that is supporting investment across the country. It's the investments in science, it's the investment in defence industry, Mr Speaker. It's the investment and support of trade opposed by those opposite, Mr Speaker. But it's also ensuring that businesses in this country can remain competitive with a competitive tax rate. Now, we already know that the United Kingdom, at a time when their deficit as a share of the economy was 10%, moved to cut corporate taxes to stimulate business investment in that country. We know that the Trump administration will also be moving to cut those taxes to support investment and to support the jobs and wages of workers in those businesses. But, Mr Speaker, I learned over the last week that the French government, indeed the French Socialist government, Mr Speaker, has also moved to reduce the French business tax rate from 33 1/3 to 28%. And, Mr Speaker, they've gone beyond that and they have adopted the same approach that this government has done with the glide path to ensure that those tax cuts start with small and medium-sized businesses. And indeed, President Hollande said we need to adapt our regulations, including for taxes, to make Paris a more attractive financial centre. So, Mr Speaker, even a socialist government in France gets it, Mr Speaker, that in order to remain competitive in this highly competitive global economy, you need to have a competitive tax rate. The only two leaders that I'm aware of that are standing against tax cuts for businesses that want to employ people are the Leader of the Opposition and Jeremy Corbyn in the United Kingdom, Mr Speaker. They are the only two leaders of political parties in advanced economies who just simply don't get it, Mr Speaker. And so what we will continue to do as we work through this session of Parliament, we will put it to those opposite who have described cutting company taxes as a Labor thing. That's what it was said when you go to the section on how do you promote growth under the Shadow Treasurer's book, How Do You Promote Growth? He says you cut the company tax rate. Well, it's not a Labor thing, Mr Speaker. It's a Labor excuse. It's a Liberal national government that actually does it.
I should have called the member for Mayo, so I apologise for that, but to keep the sequence right, I'll call the opposition and then I'll call the member for Mayo next time. The member for Port Adelaide.
Thank you, Speaker. The Prime Minister's former energy advisor, Danny Price, said that the Prime Minister's refusal to even consider an emissions intensity scheme, and I quote, shows a lack of spine. By doing this, it means they are the party of increasing electricity prices and reduced energy security. Will the Prime Minister confirm that his lack of spine and his failure to stand up to Senator Bernardi has made the Liberal government the party of increasing electricity prices and reduced energy security?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Mr Speaker, I'll invite the very capable Minister for Environment and Energy to elaborate, but I'll just make this point. The Labor Party's record on energy is not a theoretical thing. It's there for all to see. 100% increase during their time in government. And look at South Australia. Honourable members, particularly the honourable member opposite, he doesn't like to acknowledge this. He lives, I wonder, does the honourable member have a backup generator at home? Does he really do that? He really, Mr Speaker. There they are. I think he probably does, Mr Speaker. I think he's got it hidden there under a tarp in the garage because he knows that in that socialist paradise you can't keep the lights on. Yeah, the minister suggests maybe he's got a bicycle. Maybe he's like, maybe he's become a political version of a squirrel running around keeping the lights on in his place there in South Australia. Mr Speaker, look, this is a deadly serious issue for Australian jobs, for Australian families. Let's be, we can trade some good humour from time to time, but let me be very clear about this. I was there with the member for Wannon in Portland, with members of your union, Bill. I was there, and they know their jobs are at risk from Labor Party policies. It's very simple. Very simple. Their union's affiliated with the Labor Party, but it is the Labor Party's ideological approach to energy that is putting their jobs at risk. And you can't get around that fact. Unaffordable electricity, unreliable electricity means less investment, businesses closing, Australians losing their jobs. We stand for jobs, we stand for reliable and affordable electricity.
The Minister for Environment and Energy. Members on my left.
Can I just say, we know with the Labor Party, you don't look at just what they say, you look at what they do. But sometimes you need to look at what they say. So when it comes to the emissions intensity scheme, which they're promoting today, I went and had a look at what Labor's Minister for Climate Change, Penny Wong, said in 2009 about the emissions intensity scheme. This is what she said. Listen carefully. It's a mongrel. It's not a credible alternative. It's a smokescreen. That's what your own minister said. That's what your own minister said about your own policy.
Member's time has expired. Member for Jagga, the Minister, the level of interjections is far too high. The member for Shortland's been interjecting incessantly, particularly through that answer along again with the member for Barker, certainly the Assistant Minister, the Treasurer and a couple of others. I just caution them, and I also caution the member for Rankin, and I call the member for Mayo.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Over Christmas, thousands of my constituents endured several days without power, phones or internet after storms damaged electricity infrastructure. In the middle of the fire season, in one of the highest bushfire risk areas in Australia, we had few to no means of communication, as mobile base station batteries lasted just 4 hours, and in some areas our landlines also failed. I understand the downgraded NBN rollout will mean landlines will not work in power outages at all. It is outrageous that in 2017 telecommunications infrastructure would leave us so vulnerable. Prime Minister, please advise how your government will address this and safeguard telecommunications access, particularly in isolated fire risk areas such as my electorate of Mayo.
The Prime Minister has the call.
Well, I thank the honourable member for a question. And of course, the fundamental problem that her constituents faced was the consequence of the reckless energy policies of the Labor government in South Australia. Well, I'd say to the honourable member, the failure, the blackouts in South Australia were the consequence of the state's increasing dependence on Victorian power. Now, let me explain, Mr. Speaker. This is the absurdity of the Labor Party on energy policy. In order to pursue their ideal of having more renewable energy, more green energy, more lower emissions energy, they have closed a base load coal-fired power station in South Australia, the Northern Power Station, and they've closed a gas-fired power station as well. And so at Pelican...
Member for Griffith.
Thank you. Thank the Minister. So they've closed both of those, and they have a very heavy reliance, therefore, on wind energy. Now, windmills produce electricity. I make no criticism of wind energy, but it is intermittent. And what this has done is increase the dependence of South Australia on the interconnector with Victoria. And you know where that energy from Victoria comes from? Burning brown coal, the most emissions-intensive form of generating energy in Australia. So this is the absurdity and the hypocrisy of the South Australian approach. So you say, yes, we're getting rid of fossil-fired fuel sources in South Australia.
The Prime Minister resume his seat. The member for Mayo on a point of order.
Point of order in relation to relevance, Mr Speaker. My question to the Prime Minister was about telecommunications. It was not about renewable energy. It was about the fact that landlines failed and mobile towers
The member for Mayo will
on a bushfire.
resume her seat. I listened carefully to the member for Mayo's. Those on my right will cease interjecting. I'm trying to address the point of order from the member for Mayo. The member for Wakefield is warned. I listened carefully to the member for Mayo's question, and whilst certainly most of the question was about that, there was a preamble on power in South Australia, so I'm listening closely to the Prime Minister, but he's in order.
I will conclude, and I say to the honourable member that resilience of telecommunication systems is very important. The government has a mobile phone black spots program, which, remember, in 6 years of Labor government, not 1 cent was spent on mobile phone black spots at all. We have addressed the majority of the notified mobile phone black spots in Australia, with construction either underway, completed, underway or planned, putting hundreds of millions of dollars at work. Now, there have been fewer mobile phone black spot towers in South Australia than in other states, and that is because we've looked for co-contributions from states. We've had very good contribution from Victoria, for example, an especially good one from Western Australia, but very, very little from South Australia. So again, in the socialist paradise where the honourable member lives, that is the consequence of failure to invest. So resilience in telecommunication systems is vitally important. But if the honourable member is concerned about the lights going out in Mayo, that is the consequence of Labor's reckless approach to energy.
The Prime Minister's time has expired. I call the member for Capricordia.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Deputy Prime Minister and Minister for Agriculture and Water Resources. Will the Minister update the House on how the live cattle trade is supporting jobs in regional communities such as Rockhampton? Is the Minister aware of any alternative approaches that would stifle opportunities for hard-working Australians?
The Deputy Prime Minister.
Well, Mr Speaker, I thank the honourable member for a question, and might I congratulate her on the hard work that has been done making sure that we have a better outcome for those proximate to the Shoalwater Bay defence facilities, and that we now have made sure that the only purchases that will happen will be voluntary. That goes to show a government that listens, a government that is not arrogant, a government that clearly understands the issues that are there. But it's very important to also understand what has happened in the live cattle trade. I'll be pleased to tell the House that since 2011-2012 we have doubled the amount of live cattle exports, doubled the amount and tripled the value. So not only are we selling more, we're getting more for them. And this is bringing real money back into an economy which for the first time will produce in excess of $60 billion in agricultural production for our nation. This is the difference that good policy makes. This is the difference that good policy makes when we open up 9 new live animal export destinations, such as Egypt, Bahrain, Iran, Cambodia, Thailand, Lebanon, Mexico, US and China. And I'm happy to also say that that we'll be about to have our first sea shipment, which will leave from Portland, Victoria, from the seat of Wannon for China. This is all part of the process of how we are making the business of our nation work in a better way. We are making the business so the money comes back into our nation. We are making it so that the families get a better return through the farm gate. It is actually happening. It is actually happening that we have record prices in meat sheep. It is actually happening that we're getting a turnaround in the wool market, that we've had record prices in cattle. It's actually happening that we're getting a record prices in pork. We're going to turn around in so many of our lines, all the way through to wine, all the way through to tropical fruits, because this is a government that's hard at work delivering a better outcome. And there are policies out there that could stifle all this. And I suppose one of the first ones, and the member for Flynn would be very interested in this, is a Labor Party policy for a 50% renewable target. A 50% renewable target to the working men and women at the Boyne smelter would absolutely crucify them. It's the trouble with the Labor Party these days, Mr Speaker, is they don't have many people who've actually ever done any labour. The trouble with the Labor Party these days is they're fighting a battle not for the working men and women of Australia, but they're fighting a battle for Annandale. We have the Angel of Annandale, the other side of the chamber here, in a suit last worn by Barry Gibb by the looks of things. And he is fighting a battle up and down Trafalgar Street, up and down Johnson Street. He is not looking after what we want to deliver, cheaper power, cheaper power. We are not the party that is scared of talking about new coal-fired power stations. So we have to ask the member for Shortland of his constituents, does the member for Shortland's constituents understand your position about what's going to happen to their jobs? What's going to happen to the jobs in the Hunter Valley? Does the member for Hunter understand what his policy means for jobs for the people in the Hunter?
Deputy Prime Minister's time has expired. I call the member for Barton. Member for Barton has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Mr Speaker, my question is to the Prime Minister. Tasmanian's Liberal Premier Will Hodgman has said the flawed Centrelink data matching system needs to be fixed, and Liberal Senator Erica Betts has said Centrelink's robo-debt mess has, and I quote, let down the Australian people. Is the mess inside the Liberal government the reason the Prime Minister has ignored the mess his government has made of Centrelink?
Yeah. The Minister for Human Services. Minister has a call.
I thank the member for Barton for her question directed to the Prime Minister. I'm happy to take this question, and I note what the Premier has said today, and I also note what Senator Abetz has said, and what the member didn't say, that Senator Abetz, of course, also said that the policy was good and the principle was right, and that the changes that we have made are a sensible resolution to the matter. And of course, the Premier and Senator Abetz also know that we've already made a number of refinements to the system, and will continue to make a number of refinements to the system, because we want to be reasonable to Centrelink recipients and make it as easy as possible for them to be able to validate their records or correct their records if that's indeed what they want to do. But we also, Mr Speaker, want to be fair to the taxpayer. And that's exactly why we have this system in the first place. And what we do, Mr Speaker, is that we look at the self-reported income provided to Centrelink, and we compare that to the data provided to the Australian Taxation Office. And if there is discrepancy between the two, then a person is asked if they can explain that discrepancy. Sometimes they can, but if they're unable to do so, then a debt may be issued. Now, Mr Speaker, this practice has been in place, by the way, since the Labor Party introduced it in 1990 in the Data Matching Act, and then, of course, automation came into place in 2011 under none other than the Leader of the Opposition, the Deputy Leader Opposition. But why do we have to do this important work? And the reason, Mr Speaker, we have to do this important work is because it's the unfortunate reality Mr Speaker, that some people deliberately abuse the system, while many others inadvertently do not update their employment's income. And I'd like to provide some examples of this, if I could, Mr Speaker. And I'll give you one, and this was a gentleman a Queensland man who was on New Start for all the financial years 2011-12 and 2012-13. And during that time, he declared to Centrelink that he had earned income of $5,000. But the Australian Taxation Office, which relies upon income data from employers, showed that he had actually earned $100,000 during this time. Now, this occurred when Labor was in office, and had Labor actually picked up this person at the time when perhaps Tanya Plibersek was the Minister for Human Services,
the minister will
or maybe it was
the minister will refer to members by their correct titles. We'll refer to members
so
by their
when the
correct
member,
titles.
Senior was the Minister for Human Services, she wouldn't pick that up. We are now doing this hard work, Mr Deputy Speaker. We want to be reasonable to the Centrelink recipients, but we're also going to be fair to taxpayers, and they expect us to do this hard work.
Expired. The member for Grey.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for the Environment and Energy. He would be well aware that my electorate of Grey bore the brunt of last September power outages in South Australia. Port Lincoln was out for 3 days, some places 4, and what the doubling of electricity prices is doing to our bigger employers in BHP at Olympic Dam, Nearstar and Arium. Will the Minister update the House on what the government is doing to strengthen energy security and maintain energy affordability, and what hurdles stand in the way of achieving this security for hard-working Australian families?
The Minister for Energy and the Environment.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. And I thank the member for Grey for that important question because, as he said in his electorate,
member for Jagajag, I'll tell you what's going to happen if you keep interjecting.
Of energy instability in South Australia, and the major energy users like Nearstar, Arium, BHP have paid a very high price. Now, the Prime Minister, in his press club speech just a few days ago, outlined what our priorities are when they come to energy policy. Energy security, energy affordability as we transition to a lower emissions future. And we will be technology neutral in our approach. We recognise that coal and gas, fossil fuels, will play a very big role for years to come, as well as renewables, and we are investing record amounts in storage capacity. And in South Australia, what we have done is work with the Australian Energy Market Operator to reduce some of the pressure on the interconnector from Victoria into South Australia, to strengthen the settings on the wind farms to ensure they can ride out voltage disturbances. And we have done other things to ensure that there are 2 synchronous generators operating at any one time to help stabilise the system. And I visited South Australia last week, and I visited Ferguson's Australia, a major seafood business in the seat of Port Adelaide, in my opposite number seat. And they have seen their electricity bills double over the last year, and they've had to invest hundreds of thousands of dollars in backup support to ensure that their produce is not ruined before they export it, earning millions of dollars for the state and for the country. Now, Mr Speaker, all this is put at risk by those opposite. Today, just today, we have heard that their signature policy when it comes to climate change and energy policy, an emissions trading scheme, has been described by the Leader of the Opposition in the Senate, and I quote, as a mongrel. It's not a credible alternative. It's a smokescreen. That's your own policy, as said in 2009 by the Leader of the Opposition. And what about your 50% RET, which will require a $48 billion investment? What about your 45% emissions reduction target by 2030? What about your decision to force the closure of coal-fired power stations, which the Australian Energy Market Commission, which you quoted here just earlier today, has said will cost $24 billion, all on top of your emissions intensity scheme? Now, no wonder that Graham Richardson, the original fixer, has said of your policy it's a farce. You can't set policy on a wing and a hope and a prayer. It's no wonder that the unions have criticised the rush to renewables, putting in jeopardy thousands and thousands of jobs. In fact, there are only 14,000 jobs, according to the ABS, in 14-15 in renewables, and nearly 1 million jobs in Australia in manufacturing. That will be our priority, the nearly 1 million jobs in manufacturing, which are much safer under the coalition.
The member for Barton.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Mr Speaker, my question is to the Prime Minister. Anne Foley is a 67-year-old pensioner who received a Centrelink debt recovery notice for around $36,000. As a result, Centrelink cut off Mrs Foley's pension, causing her considerable stress and anxiety. But 2 weeks later, Centrelink admitted they got it completely wrong and reinstated her pension. Our pensioners like Anne suffering because the only thing the Prime Minister is focused on is trying to fix his broken government.
The Minister for Immigration and Border Protection will cease interjecting. The Prime Minister has the call.
To respond in more detail to the question, if he has the— I assume the honourable member has given the details of this constituent of hers to the minister beforehand, so that
members on my left.
But if she hasn't, if she has not, if she's not made that available, then the minister will certainly investigate the matter that you've raised. But I just want to repeat what he said, that the focus has been to ensure that where anomalies are detected, consistent with practices put in place long ago under the Labor government, people are entitled to, are able to correct the record, and of course, if they do owe money to Centrelink, then it should be recovered. But I'll ask the minister to enlarge on that.
The Minister for Human Services.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. And as the Prime Minister said, I'd be happy to look into the case that the member has identified. I'm sure she would have informed that constituent of hers to call the 1800 number. I'm sure she would have informed her constituent that that person had an opportunity for a reassessment, for a review,
the member for
Kingston, further appeal, because that has always been the case, those opportunities. But, Mr Speaker, I am always very careful when Labor puts up examples of people who have been aggrieved, and I make no judgment of this particular case. But over the summer, Labor put up some 52 examples to the media of people who were so-called aggrieved by this process. It transpires that a third of all of those cases had nothing to do with the online compliance system. And of the ones that did, the majority also owed money back to the taxpayer. And the member for Barton herself admitted that the people that she put up to the media, she could not know whether or not they actually owed money or not, but she put them up in any case. And I'll provide some examples of the ones which she did put up to the media, Mr Deputy Speaker, and it provides a very clear case as to why we need to do this important work for the taxpayer. Here's one, a Victorian person. The person had
Minister
received—
will just resume his seat for a second there. The Manager of Opposition Business on a point of order.
Thanks, Mr Speaker. On direct relevance, this question deals with one constituent who received a debt notice of $36,000 and had her pension stopped. That is what is relevant to this question.
The Minister for Immigration and Border Protection will cease interjecting. The Treasurer will cease interjecting, as will the Leader of the House. The Minister for Human Services has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. As I was saying, here's a case that the Labor Party put up to the media. The person who had received income
I just
support
say to the
for
Minister, the Minister, he's had a preamble. There was a very specific element to the question. He's entitled to address. Members on my left will cease interrupting me. He's entitled to address the policy issue, but in the remaining time he needs to bring himself to the specific part of the question or wind his answer up.
Yep. Thank you, Mr Speaker. As I said, very happy to look at that particular case. But here's another example of ones which they've put up to the media. And this goes to the heart of why we need to have a robust system like this. And it's a person they put up who had declared income of $9,000 when in fact the ATO data showed $48,000 from a business.
The Minister will resume his seat. There's 4 seconds left. The Manager of Opposition Business is seeking to raise another point of order under relevance, I presume, which is—
Not under relevance.
Okay,
you gave a ruling on relevance and the minister is now flouting that ruling.
Yes. I'll be the judge of that. As I said, the question did have a specific element. It had another element to it as well. And I'll just give the minister— I think with 4 seconds to go, that's probably enough, I think. And I'll call The member for Fisher. The member for Fisher.
Mr Speaker, my question is to the Minister for Defence Industry, representing the Minister for Employment. Will the Minister outline how industrial relations reform supports the creation of jobs for hard-working Australians? Is the Minister aware of any unions who do not support the restoration of the rule of law to building and construction sites around this country?
The Minister for Defence Industry.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for Fisher for his question, because I know that he, like the rest of the government, is very interested in the effect that the Australian Building and Construction Commission can bring to the wider economy in Australia in creating jobs and investment and growth. And I'm very pleased to say, Mr Speaker, that the last time the Australian Building and Construction Commission was in place, it saved consumers $7.5 billion in costs. It increased productivity in the building and construction industry by 16.5%, and it led to a very real reduction in days lost due to industrial strife. And last year, as the House would know, the Turnbull government passed legislation to bring back the Australian Building and Construction Commission, a signature achievement after many attempts over the previous 3 years. And, Mr Speaker, you would assume that every member of the House, whether it was Labor or crossbench or government, would want to create the kind of jobs that can be created through higher productivity in building and construction by having less union militant behaviour, by reducing price to consumers. But not so, Mr Speaker. The Leader of the Opposition led the Labor Party into opposing the Australian Building and Construction Commission. And many of us in the national polity scratched our heads and wondered why, Mr Speaker. Well, I think we've now picked up a few reasons why. There may well be a clue, because in the revelations of the year of funding up to the 2016 federal election, the union movement spent an incredible $26.5 million, Mr Speaker, $26.5 million of other people's money, campaigning against the Turnbull government, Mr Speaker. $9.7 million
Member for Griffith has been warned.
To the ALP, including $1 million from the CFMEU, donated directly to the ALP, $16.5 million spent on political campaigns, including $300,000 from the CFMEU. So they spent $1.2 million in the lead-up to the 2016 election in 1 year, campaigning against the Turnbull government. So the union movement put $26.5 million of other people's money into campaigning against the Turnbull government, and the Leader of the Opposition, he certainly followed the adage that he who pays the piper calls the tune, because the #1 priority of the AMWU, of the CFMEU, of the MUA was to stop the Australian Building and Construction Commission, and that is precisely what Labor's policy was. Labor dismantled the ABCC. They opposed it root and branch, and that is because this Leader of the Opposition is in hock to the union movement.
The member for Sydney.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Does the Prime Minister agree with the member for Warringah that, and I quote, "the first duty of the leader is to keep the party together"? How's that going?
Before I call the Prime Minister, I regret to inform the member for Sydney that that question is out of order. I'll go to the next question. The member for Barker.
My question is to the Minister for Foreign Affairs.
Yes.
Will the Minister update the House on how the government is promoting Australia's national interests in strengthening our bilateral relationships? Is the Minister aware of any alternative approaches that would threaten our national interest?
The Minister for Foreign Affairs.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for Barker for his question, and I can confirm that the Australian government is working hard to strengthen and deepen our bilateral relationships with countries in our region and globally, for it is in our national interest to ensure that we have the strongest possible strategic, political and economic ties. For example, this afternoon I will be hosting Foreign Minister Wang Yi here in Canberra for the 4th Australia-China Foreign and Strategic Dialogue. This will be probably the 9th bilateral meeting that I've had with Foreign Minister Wang, and this is an opportunity for us to discuss a range of common interests and issues, regional, global, but of course in the bilateral sphere we will be talking about the achievements of the China-Australia Free Trade Agreement, which celebrated its first anniversary on the 20th of December. Now, members on this side of the House know that given the size of our population, our prosperity and our standard of living depends upon the ability of our businesses, small and medium and large, to export our goods and services to marketplaces around the world. And last year, under the China-Australia Free Trade Agreement and more broadly, our merchandise exports to China were worth about $75 billion and our services exports to China about $10.7 billion. In relation to the member for Barker's own state of South Australia, last year 1/5 of all exports from South Australia went to China. And in particular areas of interest to the member, bottled wine exports increased by 40%. The export of abalone, fresh and chilled abalone, increased about 50%. And navel oranges, there was an increase in the export of navel oranges by about 55%. And Impi Highlands, that's a citrus grower in Renmark, said that pursuant to the China-Australia Free Trade Agreement and the implementation of it, the Chinese market was now a game changer for the citrus industry. And that's another example of how important these free trade deals are. I've been asked if there are any alternative approaches, and sadly I have to say that the Labor Party has a very patchy record when it comes to trade agreements, even though they are about promoting more Australian jobs. It was up to the coalition to ensure that we negotiated the free trade agreements with China, Japan and Korea after years of absolute inactivity. And I'm afraid that the Leader of the Opposition also has form. He encouraged that xenophobic union campaign against the China-Australia Free Trade Agreement. On this side of the House, we know that more marketplaces give more opportunities for export businesses, which means more jobs.
The Minister's time has expired. The member for Petrie on a point of order.
Look, Mr Speaker, the member for McEwen was making sexist comments to the Foreign Minister then at the start of that question, and I'd ask him to withdraw.
The member for Petrie well knows it's impossible for me to hear everything that's uttered across the chamber. All I can do is ask the member for McEwen whether he used unparliamentary language or reflected upon a member.
Speaker,
the member for McEwen resume his seat. The manager of opposition business has the call.
Thanks, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Today's print media runs comments from numerous members of the PM's own government, airing grievances about the internal workings of the Liberal Party, including today the Daily Telegraph, the Herald Sun.
Manager of opposition business resume his seat. The Minister for Transport and Infrastructure is interjecting loudly into my ear. I can't hear the question. I'm going to ask the Manager of Opposition Business to resume again, and if there's a repeat of it, I'll have to take action. The Manager of Opposition Business will begin his question again.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. The question is to the Prime Minister. Today's print media includes comments from a large number of members of the Prime Minister's own government, airing grievances about the internal workings of the Liberal government, including in the Daily Telegraph, the Herald Sun, the Tiser, the Sydney Morning Herald, the Courier Mail, the Fin Review, the Australian. They've all got examples of this. Prime Minister, when thousands of people are losing their jobs at Toyota and Holden, why are members of the government only talking about themselves?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Mr Speaker, it's not so long ago that the Leader of the Opposition spoke at the Press Club, indeed last week, just the day before I did, and he said that he was going to be focused on people rather than politics. And what we see is one cheap shot after another. How long did that last? Now, our policies are very clear, very
Member for
plain,
Parramatta.
focused on jobs, investment, economic growth, improving and expanding the opportunities for hard-working Australian families. Everything we're doing is focused on that. We're trying to open up more export markets. We've opened up some big ones. The Foreign Minister just described the very real, practical ways in which those big new markets have provided more opportunities for Australian businesses to get ahead and employ more Australians. And what we're doing is ensuring, or seeking to ensure, that businesses get a tax break so that they will invest more and employ more. And what we're seeking to do is to build the infrastructure around the country, $50 billion and more in infrastructure, not to speak of completing the NBN years and years ahead of time from the Labor Party would have done. So we're getting on with the job, and everything we're doing will generate more investment and more jobs. And what does Labor present? They do not have one single policy, Mr Speaker, not one, which would encourage one single business to invest one more dollar. They do not have any policies that will encourage employment. Indeed, they want to have higher taxes, more regulation, higher debt, fewer markets, fewer opportunities to get ahead, and to cap all of that, they have policies that are guaranteed to make energy unaffordable and unreliable. There is never, I have to say this, the opposition leader is consistent on one thing alone. He is against jobs, he's against investment, he's against the opportunities that Australians today and generations to come deserve, and will only come through more investment, more economic growth, bigger markets, wider horizons for Australians to build their businesses and employ more Australians here. That's what we're doing. Labor is standing in the way. Every single policy calculated to stop employment, stop investment, stop the growth we need.
The member for Hughes.
My question is to the Minister for Immigration and Border Protection. Will the Minister update the House on steps the government is taking to ensure foreign workers are a supplement to and not a substitute for Australian workers? And how does this compare with other approaches?
The Minister for Immigration and Border Protection.
Well, thank you very much, Mr Speaker, and I thank the honourable member for his question. It's an important question because the Prime Minister just made reference to a speech given by the Leader of the Opposition at the Press Club only last week, where he trumpeted the fact that he wanted to be the champion of Australian jobs. But do you know what? Don't trust this Leader of the Opposition. Don't trust this Leader of the Opposition, because he says one thing to one audience and then he does the complete opposite when he thinks people aren't watching. And I'll tell you what, Mr Speaker, this Leader of the Opposition, when he was a minister in the Rudd and Gillard governments, did exactly the same. So when Australians around the country have a hesitation when they see this Leader of the Opposition on their television sets of a night time, they've got their instinct right, because this Leader of the Opposition can't be trusted. He can't be trusted because he's more interested in the interests of the union bosses than the workers. He's demonstrated it throughout his working life, and that is the lot of this Leader of the Opposition. Now, Mr Speaker, it is true that this Leader of the Opposition, when he was the Employment Minister in the good old days of the Rudd-Gillard-Rudd years, he was the champion of jobs for some workers. The trouble is they were overseas workers. So in his speech last week, the Leader of the Opposition wanted Australians to believe that he was going to put Australians first for Australian jobs, but the reality is when he was the Employment Minister during the Rudd-Gillard-Rudd years, he did exactly the opposite. So he's complained about the 457 visa program, where we put workers first, and the policy of this government is to find Australian jobs and to put Australian workers into those jobs, and if we can't fill those jobs, then people can come in under 457 visas. Now, this Leader of the Opposition thought it opportunistic last week to come out and criticise the government for the number of 457 visas that we've issued. The trouble is the number was many times more during his period as Employment Minister. So how can you trust How can you trust this Labor Leader of the Opposition? He was untrustworthy to Julia Gillard and Kevin Rudd. He was untrustworthy to workers that he pretended to represent as a union leader, and he is in this place pretending to represent Australians when really he has done the complete opposite every day that he's been in this place. Now, we know that registered nurses, for example, in 2015-16 there were just over 1,000 457 visas issued. Do you know the number in 2012-13 under Labor?
Tell us.
2,853. So let me say this in closing, Mr Speaker. We are not going to be lectured by a hypocrite. We are not going to be lectured by a person who is unworthy of the high office that he holds.
Withdraw the term hypocrite. Thank you. The Prime Minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I ask that further questions be placed in the note.